Dave Smith Unleashed. This is, I think, episode number 3 of the new podcast, and I hope everybody had a very, very good Easter weekend. Boy, my Easter Sunday was fantastic, and I'll tell you why here before we bring on our special guest. When I was growing up, it was chaos always on Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas when the family got together. We always met at the grandparents' house, and my mom and dad and the cousins and aunts and uncles were all there, and it was always chaos and melee. My Uncle Dick would show up and start drinking, and he'd start insulting people, and one time he wound up in a fist fight out in the backyard with my dad, his own brother. It was always chaos, but this time, my Sunday here, woke up, sat in the house by myself, watched true crime shows, watched a little NBA playoffs, watched a little baseball. Nobody came over, no family. And I said to myself, boy, I finally figured it out. This is how you do it. Spend it by yourself and don't invite anybody. No family. So I had a great time. Hopefully that was the case for all of you as well. And, of course, Dave Smith Unleashed brought to you by MTS Transportation. Call them at 800-640-6873. Reliable, on-time delivery, compliance you can count on, round-the-clock support, superior communication, experienced logistic partners. Mention the Dave Smith Unleashed show, of course, and get 20% off on all your shipments. So make sure for all your shipping and freight needs, go to MTS Transportation at 800-640-6873. All right, let's get out to the guest hotline. And boy, I love the fact that he agreed to do this because I am such a big fan of Gerald Posner. I read Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK back in 1993. And to this day, there's been over 2,000 JFK books published, and we've seen all the documentaries. This is the most well-researched, thorough book I've ever read. So it's an honor to bring him on here to talk about the release of the new files and the assassination and all that's happened since. The great Gerald Posner. What's up, Gerald? Nice to meet you, and thanks for coming on.
Dave, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Did you have any crazy drunken uncles back in your day ruining the family get-togethers?
I was thinking about that when you just described that. I was thinking, boy, in comparison, my Easter celebrations were so calm, I guess, in comparison. We had, typical Italian, American Catholic side of the family, lots of food. There'd be some red wine and everything, but nobody ever really lost it. Boy, in comparison, it was very, very mild. No fistfights.
I'll never forget, my uncle insulted my mother, and I turned around a few minutes later, and he and my dad were punching it out in the backyard in suits and ties. So that's one memory I'll never forget.
That is one that will stay with you.
The fantastic book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. Joe, first of all, what made you decide to write this book? Because I've seen interviews with you before, and you said you were originally kind of a skeptic and believed some of the conspiracy theories. So what made you dive into this?
Yeah, Dave, I wasn't sure what the case would hold if I actually investigated it, but I'd been interested in it since law school. I'd gone to law school in the late 70s at a time when they were having the House Select Committee on Assassinations reinvestigate the case, and I followed it pretty closely. And then I never thought I'd actually be writing anything about it, but after writing a couple of other books, I approached Random House and said, hey, this is about 89 or 90. I said, would you be interested in a book on the JFK assassination? That as a lawyer, I look into the case, determine which evidence is good and which evidence isn't, what's credible, what's not, because I said not all the theories can be right. It can't be the mob killed him, if the CIA killed him, if the KGB killed him, if Castro killed him. So if you ask me what my bias was then, I probably thought it could be the mafia because of Ruby's killing of Oswald 2 days after he's arrested. That looks like it's enough to raise your suspicions that he's been silenced. So that's what I went into. And Random House said, we're not interested in a book that looks at that and here it says, here's the evidence in the case. Nobody's interested in reading that. And then Oliver Stone did the one good thing he ever did for me, which unintentionally, he did the film JFK, great film, but terrible history. And he energized the conspiracy theories for a whole new generation. And Random House came back to me and you said, Stone has put the JFK assassination back on the popular radar. So maybe there's a market for a book that just reexamines the evidence. And I never expected to reach a conclusion, but about halfway through my research, I did start to compile the evidence that made me believe that there was an answer to this case. And I went back to the publisher and told them they could put out a book that actually said who killed Kennedy. And I remember this, Dave, like it was yesterday. The publisher, my editor, said to me, who? And I said, Oswald. And they said, and who? And I said, just Oswald. And there was this moment of semi-panic because they were thinking to themselves, oh my God, he went off and read the Warren Commission, and he thinks it's Oswald alone. How are we going to publish a book that says that? Then when they saw what was new and how it was done, then they got excited about it. But there was that moment in which they weren't sure that that book would actually be of interest to anyone.
Well, we just had 77,000 pages released, when President Trump, with the executive order, wanted to release all the files. And they say there's a lot more to come, but it doesn't seem to be any real bombshell information or anything new or anything that's going to blow the case open, at least so far.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. Since the book was published in '93, when you originally read it, the government's released over 1 million pages of files in total. So a ton of material has come out of there. And now we're down to the last, under 1% of files that have been held back for all these years. And I understand the average person, if you talk to them about the JFK assassination, one of the first things I always hear is, hey, what about those files? They've still got things sealed, so they must have some real secrets in there. And what I think people don't realize is the government holds on to things, classifies them, keeps information away because they're hiding information about what the CIA was doing and when it was doing it, and some embarrassment about a covert operation and what went wrong. It often has nothing to do at all with the assassination. And that's what we're finding in these last 70,000 that came out. There are all types of tidbits and information in there, nuggets of history about the CIA and how it operated, but it tells you nothing about the assassination or who killed Kennedy. And that's not a surprise for most of us who have studied the case. But I think it is a surprise to a lot of Americans who expected there to be some type of big bombshell.
And Anna Paulina Luna, the congresswoman from Florida, she said she'd read through some of the files and said something that she heard and something that she thought she saw. NBC has been withholding video evidence that they've had for over 60 years, and it shows Lee Harvey Oswald standing in front of the book depository while the assassination was happening and proves that he didn't do it. That sounds ridiculous to me, that NBC could keep that quiet for over 60 years.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. It will tell you a lot about, I guess, the gullibility of Representative Luna to think that the secret to the assassination was going to be found in an NBC film that somehow the network itself had decided not to release, but all she had to do was ask for it. And it turns out to be actually an old bit of film that has been discussed before, in which somebody claimed they thought that a fuzzy image of a person standing on the left side of the Texas School Book Depository, the building from which Oswald fired the shots, they said that looks like Oswald there as this blurry figure goes by. So he couldn't have been downstairs watching the motorcade go by if he was also upstairs doing the shooting. Well, the problem is that everybody else who is clearly identifiable in that picture all said at the time when they were investigated in 1963 and 64 by the FBI, no, Oswald wasn't one of the people standing next to us. And that person's actually been identified as a woman, an employee inside the depository. It's not even a man. So Representative Luna was definitely off the mark on that. She's also said, as you know, Dave, that she thinks there were two shooters. She's sort of, if you prejudge the case, if you come to a conclusion about what you think the case says, you don't follow the evidence where it takes you, then you can always pick and choose some extraneous bit of evidence or somebody's eyewitness account that's been discredited by everybody else and say, this supports what I really think. I was convinced that when I started to look into the assassination, the one thing I had to do was follow whatever the evidence said, and I still believe that. So, if somebody was able to come up tomorrow with absolute evidence that proved to me that Oswald was the shooter, which I'm convinced that is established beyond any doubt in terms of ballistics and forensics evidence. But if somebody was then able to show that he was part of a plot and he did it for the mafia or he did it for Castro, that evidence was credible, I'd have to say, okay, there's the evidence of a conspiracy. But other people go into it, and I think Representative Luna is one of them. They aren't honest brokers looking for the truth. They've determined what the answer is, and then they're going to go about and get that. And the best evidence of that was that 3 witnesses that she called in her first hearing wasn't about establishing some new breakthrough piece of evidence. She didn't have anything about 2 shooters or anything about the conspiracy in terms of what was done to Kennedy's body or what Oswald was doing. She had Oliver Stone in, repeating sort of the fake news that he had originally in his film, over 30 years ago. A researcher who's worked with Oliver Stone who believes everything in the kitchen sink, and another researcher, Jefferson Morley, who believes that the CIA was really behind the assassination. So I don't think she's looking what I call a balanced probe into who killed Kennedy.
You know, when I visited Dallas, and I went up into the Texas School Box Depository a couple of years ago, and you know what really surprised me, Gerald, was I went up into the bird's nest there and looked out the window, and they have X's on the ground where Kennedy was actually hit. What an easy shot it was. You know, when you watch it on television and you watch documentaries, it looks like it's a long way away. Oswald was right on top of that limo. It looks like a really easy shot, especially for a Marine with sniper training with a scope on his rifle. I think that convinced me more than ever that it was a pretty easy shot. And for people to say, well, Oswald could have never pulled it off on his own and it was too big a job, that I think proved it to me, and his background kind of proved it to me as well.
Yeah, I often think that people say to me, "What's the single piece of evidence that convinces you more than anything else about the conclusions in the case that you've reached?" And I say it's sort of Oswald himself. That's not a simple soundbite, but to understand Oswald, who just turned 24 years old, we often forget how young he was. 24 years old, filled with this idea that he's going to change the world through violence. He's already committed to assassination, and the person that he wanted to assassinate wasn't Kennedy, was actually a retired Army running for the governorship of Texas, a right-winger called Edwin Walker,
yep.
right? And he missed him as the bullet grazed along a window frame and just missed Walker's head by an inch, just in April, a few months before he kills Kennedy. And then Kennedy becomes to him almost this target of opportunity. He's a guy who thinks that he hates the United States, but he went over to the Soviet Union where he defected after the Marines in '59, and he learned to dislike the Soviet Union because he thought they had bastardized his form of communism. So he wants to get to Cuba, where he thinks the real revolution is taking place. And just 6 weeks before Kennedy visits Dallas, where's Oswald? He's in Mexico City trying to get a visa at the Cuban mission there and at the Soviet mission to go to Havana. And both of them turn him down. And we now know, because the Soviets and Cubans have finally provided their files after all these years, that his behavior there at those two embassies was pretty unhinged. He took out his pistol. He has a .38 caliber at one point. The same gun that he ends up killing a police officer with after the assassination, J.D. Tippit. He takes that gun out at the Soviet mission, slams it on the desk, and says, if the FBI keeps coming after me, I'm going to use it on them. One of the KGB agents in the room takes the pistol away, empties the bullets in that, and they usher him out of that embassy. They conclude that he's psychotic at the point. So he's an unusual character. And when you say that you were at Dealey Plaza and you looked out that window and thought the shots were much easier, I totally agree with you. I think that anybody who visits Dealey Plaza, it's a bit like going to a football stadium or, a baseball stadium. If you've only seen them on TV, they look very large. And then sometimes you get there and they seem a little bit more intimate, a little bit tighter and not quite so grand. And that's definitely true about Dealey Plaza. People forget that from that perch that Oswald had, the final shot, which is the farthest shot away from where he is, it looks like it's only 25 yards away through his 4-power scopes. It's 100 yards away. That's where Kennedy is. And at that moment, he has the most time for that third shot. He's missed one shot entirely. A second shot is not fatal, hits the president, goes on to wound the governor, the so-called single bullet. And then he has a full 5 seconds to recock that World War II vintage Italian carbine he has. He aims again through a scope. Kennedy, wounded from the second shot, is sitting straight in the car. His head's rolled a little bit to the left. He's got a back brace on. People forget about that, so it keeps him propped up. The driver of the limousine makes a major mistake and turns around to look at the back of the car to see what's going on because he's heard the commotion from the front 2 shots. So the limousine slows to between 3 and 5 miles an hour. No evasive actions at all. Oswald gets the straight-on shot, looks like 25 yards away, and he still almost misses, Dave. He hits Kennedy in the high right rear portion of the head. An inch and a quarter higher, he would miss entirely. It would be a failed assassination. But he catches Kennedy in the skull, blows out the front of his head, and it turns into a lethal assassination. So people say, hey, he wasn't the greatest shot in the world. Marksman and sharpshooter and Marines agreed. 3 shots here on Kennedy, one of them works.
And he ordered that what Mannlicher Carcano rifle through a magazine. He took a picture of himself. Well, his wife took a picture of him in the backyard holding it. They had a palm print, I believe, on the rifle. They found the shell casings that matched the rifle up in the bird's nest. Seems like a pretty open and shut case that only one man took those shots and only one man killed him.
Well, it's interesting you say that because Oswald goes out the night before the assassination to where his wife is staying in a suburb of Dallas, and he visits her and the friend that she's staying with because they're separated at that point. They've had a very rocky, violent marriage, and he has to go there because that's where his rifle is in the garage. His wife doesn't realize that he's stored it in there. He takes that rifle and he wraps it in brown paper completely, and the next morning he gets a ride into work. The fellow driving him in says, "What is that?" He says, "Curtain rods." Oswald was living at a rooming house with these other guys. His room did not need any curtains. It didn't have any. So that's where the gun is taken in that morning. And you're absolutely right. He's left alone on the sixth floor of the depository by six of his coworkers half an hour before Kennedy goes in front of the book depository. They go down for lunch. Nobody else comes up. He sets up a sniper's nest by building boxes in this corner of the window where he can look out but not easily be seen by other neighboring buildings. And what is found in that little sniper's nest afterwards, there's the paper bag left in the back that he brought the gun in that morning. That has his left index finger and right palm prints on the paper bag. On the box directly behind him that he can use to sit on is the right palm print. On the top box where he's resting the gun is his right index finger, and his left palm print is on the corner of that box. And then on the gun itself is his right palm print on the end of the wooden stock. And people say, well, we don't think it's him. And I say, all you do is follow the evidence, and you start to get the idea that where he was and what he was doing.
Gerald Posner joining Dave Smither on Dave Smith Unleashed. The great book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the JFK Assassination. I would recommend everybody go out and get, published in 1993. To me, that's the Bible, the most well-researched book ever on the JFK assassination. Now, after he shoots Kennedy, he leaves. I think he gets on a bus or a cab and goes back to his house to get a pistol. And then he kills J.D. Tippit, an officer who thought that Oswald matched the description that the police were looking for and wanted to stop and chat with him. But there's conspiracy theories abounding that he's not the one who shot Tippit, and that's not what really happened. But the evidence seems to point otherwise.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable because what's interesting about Oswald is Oswald's the only one of the employees at the Texas School Book Depository who leaves after the assassination. Everyone else is there. When the police make them all gather downstairs because they want to interview them, who's missing? It's Oswald. And anybody who knows Oswald or a little bit about him, and he was a political junkie. He fancied himself a very clever guy, smarter than he really was. If he really was there and knew nothing about the assassination, when he was told that they had just shot at the president of the United States in front of the building that he worked at, the Lee Harvey Oswald that everybody knew would have been out in front of the depository, walking around, trying to get information, saying what happened, trying to determine whether the president had been hit. He would have been one of those news junkies. Instead, what does he do? You're right. He leaves the depository in a minute and a half. He takes a taxi for the first time in his life because he doesn't have much money. He can't afford that. But the traffic is so thick that he gets out of that taxi and then gets on a bus going back where? To the rooming house for one thing, to grab that pistol. And then when he's walking, we don't know where, because Oswald clearly wasn't a suicide mission, Dave. He had some plan in his mind, at least how to get out of Dallas and where he was going to go. We just don't know. He had as much money on his pocket, a little bit over $15, where he could have caught a bus to take him back to Laredo, Texas, and then on to Mexico City. So maybe he was going to try to get to Cuba again, but that's just speculation. But the one thing that's clear is his plans were interrupted by J.D. Tippit, who's a Dallas policeman. 4 times there had been this all-points bulletin broadcast with a description, a generic description, mid-20s, brown hair, Caucasian, slender, based upon an eyewitness who had seen Oswald in the 6th floor window making the shots. A construction worker, Howard Brennan, at Dealey Plaza, had looked up and actually seen the gun out the window. He's the only witness to look at the shooter. He's the one who gives the police the rough description that then is broadcast out. And when Tippit pulls him over, Tippit doesn't think that it is the person who is the assassin, but he's suspicious about Oswald for some reason. The reason I say he doesn't think it's the person who's the assassin, because the protocol for the Dallas police was that if you pulled over what you thought was a suspect from an all-points bulletin, you called in on the radio to headquarters and you said, I think I've got a possible suspect on this all-points bulletin, pulling him over now. Tippit didn't do that. He didn't take his gun out. He stepped out of the car, and Oswald is the one who then whipped out his pistol, shoots him point blank in front of literally 10 witnesses. who then later pick him out of a lineup and identify him. The gun matched to the exclusion of other gun to the gun that killed Tippit. So when people say they don't think that Oswald shot Tippit, I always find that to be even far more outrageous even than the Kennedy assassination, because you have him shooting him in front of witnesses with the pistol that he bought from mail order that he had with him, for the last 6 months. And that is a man in flight. He then tries to sneak into a movie theater, which he does, and hopes that he can stay there until the police are gone. But he's followed by somebody who saw him shoot Tippit, and then they tell the police where he is, and that's how he gets arrested.
Now, Jack Ruby, who owned the Carousel Club, a strip club in Dallas, he loved police. He loved having them in there. He liked having them around, and he'd set them up and give them free drinks. And that has spawned some rumors that J.D. Tippit used to go in there because he was a police officer and he knew Ruby. And then in JFK, we see a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald sitting in there with Jack Ruby, and he's introducing him around to people. Has there ever been any evidence that the three of them knew each other or there's any connection?
No, there's no evidence at all that that Tippit was a regular at the Carousel. Absolutely not. But more than that, that the idea, I always loved the idea that what Oliver Stone has in his film, that Oswald is sort of hanging around inside Jack Ruby's bar, and then they call on Ruby to go ahead and kill Oswald a couple of days later. And why would they have to do that if there's some grand conspiracy, by the way? So let's say there's some grand conspiracy. Oliver Stone's right. It's the deep state who kills Kennedy. And Oswald's either going to be set up as a patsy, right? Or he knows something. If he's a patsy, if you're a real patsy in a crime, you don't have to kill anybody because you don't know what happened to you. It's like a freight train running over you. You get arrested for the crime. All the evidence points to you. You say, I didn't do it. And the next thing you know, you're convicted because they've set you up. The only reason they have to kill you is if somehow you knew something about the conspiracy. So Oswald then knows something, and what did they decide to do? They pulled off the perfect crime in Dallas, but they forgot to have some dirty cop shoot him at Dealey Plaza when he's trying to get out of the Texas School Book Depository. I guarantee you that if it had been a plot like Oliver Stone thought, Lee Harvey Oswald would have been shot at Dealey Plaza by a cop who would have gotten a hero's medal for shooting the wanted assassin. But instead, somehow they forget to do that. And then they don't do it on Friday night when he's in jail, even though he could spill the beans about the conspiracy. They don't do it on Saturday when he's still in jail and he could still spill the beans on the entire deep state conspiracy. And on Sunday, when Ruby finally kills him, Ruby almost misses even seeing him because Ruby's taking his time and waking up late, goes down to send a MoneyGram to a stripper of his who asked for it. And the only Western Union office open in Dallas that day is downtown, about a block and a half away from where Oswald's going to be transferred from the police station. It turns out that Oswald's running late. He asked for a change of clothes. A postal inspector had come to interview him. And Ruby, who is taking his time and sending the MoneyGram out, walks down the street, walks down that ramp into the police station, and it's where history meets. Oswald is being taken out at the exact moment Ruby arrives. And in Jack Ruby's world, you know enough about him from reading about him, Dave. Rough and tough guy, used to be his own bouncer, carried his gun all the time, wannabe mobster. He wasn't a member of the mafia, but wanted to be a tough guy, and he was a tough guy. In Jack Ruby's world, this guy, this no-good guy, killed the president of the United States, and Ruby was going to even the score by killing him, and he thought he would be a hero. Is absolutely wrong, but thought that people would say, Jackie did the right thing. Didn't realize that he had screwed it up for everybody, including history.
Now, you brought up a good point. I was going to ask you that next. If it was a conspiracy and he was set up to go in there and kill Oswald, he walked in to send that MoneyGram to one of the girls who danced for him, and then Oswald came down late, and after he came out to send the MoneyGram, he saw the commotion there, and Oswald hadn't even come down the elevator and come through the garage yet. So what was his motivation? I think you said in your book that he saw a smirk on Oswald's face, like a half smile, and that really ticked him off, even though he was upset anyway. So what was his motivation, thinking, well, he can go to jail for the rest of his life if he does this?
Yeah, I think so. I follow Ruby in Case Closed, I think, in a few chapters more carefully, hour by hour, from the time of the assassination through to the time that he kills Oswald, than I think any book had done beforehand. And what really happens to Ruby is he gets worked up over that weekend into this angry frenzy of sorts. His sister is really working on him and talking. She doesn't want him to kill Oswald, but she's talking about what a disgrace it is, how Dallas has been disgraced. Ruby was Jewish, and although he wasn't a religious Jew, He felt strongly about Judaism, and there had been a full-page advertisement in the Dallas newspapers when Kennedy arrived, calling Kennedy a traitor, signed with a Jewish name. Ruby thought that was a fake name. It turned out to be a real person, but he thought that they were sort of setting the Jews up to look bad. He was mad at Oswald. He was furious about everything. When he drove down on that Sunday, Ruby was at the police station on Friday night. And I mean, of course, he shouldn't have been allowed in. The Dallas police were an open sieve. The security is nothing like what we would have today. But you said before, and you're absolutely right, Ruby had a strip club that a lot of police went to, and Jack Ruby liked to be around where the action was. And where the action was on Friday night in Dallas, that Friday night was at the police headquarters because they had arrested the guy accused of killing the president. He was giving his business card out to some of the reporters, like a guy from the French newspapers, saying, by the way, when this calms down and before you leave town, be sure to come into the Carousel Club. So Ruby's bringing in pizzas and sandwiches. He's hanging out there, and let's assume that he's been told by the secret state to go ahead and kill Oswald. By the way, Jack, you got the biggest assignment of your career because you got to kill this guy who we forgot to kill. He's now in police custody. So Jack goes down to police headquarters on Friday night. And there's a moment in which you can see Oswald taken out. He's not far away from Ruby on a still picture. Ruby has sort of a lump in his back jacket. That's where he used to carry his pistol. And I guess Jack decided that night on Friday, I'm not in the mood. So he lets him pass. On Saturday, Ruby was back at police headquarters, and they take Oswald out a couple of times from the room that he's being interrogated in. Ruby's there and doesn't make any effort to shoot at Oswald. It's only on Sunday, when it's unplanned that they will run into each other, that Ruby's finally at this breaking point, and he's so angry about the situation that when he sees Oswald coming out, and it does look like Oswald has that smirk. He looks like the cat, the Cheshire cat that swallowed the canary. That just sort of triggers Ruby, and Ruby shoots him and says, "You shot my president, you rat." It's sort of like out of a James Cagney movie. And when the police tackle him, he says, you know me. He's yelling, "You know me. It's Jack. It's Jack." He thinks that he's going to get at the most a crime in Texas at the time called murder without malice. So you kill somebody, but you don't have any malice, sort of like manslaughter in other states. Maximum sentence 5 years. And he's ready to do that time. Jack thinks he can do that on his head. 5 years in prison, no problem. He was stunned when he got convicted of a murder sentence.
Now, he was always begging that I want to go to Washington, D.C. and testify. I can tell what I know if I go to D.C. and I talk to Congress and I talk to the House, and they never allowed him to do it. Why didn't they let him out to go testify in Washington, D.C.? Because he said he didn't feel safe doing it in Dallas.
Yeah, they interviewed him extensively in Dallas for the Warren Commission. They had him interviewed, and he is pretty far out there at this time. Ruby thinks that there are people inside the jail walls. At one point, he says they're burning Jews inside other parts of the jail. I can hear them. He thinks there's a vast conspiracy that sort of made him operate to kill Oswald, and he has gone off what I call sort of the deep end. However, that being said, although I think they didn't bring him back because they thought that he was useless in terms of his testimony, I still would have done it. There are a number of errors the Warren Commission made. They were wrong on the shooting sequence of the shots at Dealey Plaza. They gave Oswald only 5.5 seconds because they thought the first shot at Kennedy and the second missed. They got that wrong. They investigated Ruby's possible ties to the mafia, but they didn't do it in an aggressive manner because some of the information that later came out didn't come out for nearly a decade that proved that there was no connection. So what I call it was an investigation, but not the strongest. They should have brought Ruby up to Washington and let him rattle on for 3 hours or 10 hours if he wanted to with nonsense so that there would be no questions about that. In the end, would more people have believed that it was a lone assassin? I'm not sure, because I think that Ruby's murder of Oswald, Dave, sort of is the reason that I will never have a consensus on this case. Oswald never had his day in court. The evidence was never tested, by defense attorneys and that. If he had had that day in court, just like James Earl Ray did years later on the King assassination, Ray kept saying he pled guilty and then he took the plea back. And then he said, I was set up by this mysterious guy, Raul. And you know what? A few people believed him, including the King family eventually, but a lot of people didn't believe him because the evidence was set out in a trial and it was overwhelming against Ray. If the evidence had been set out against Oswald, he hadn't been killed by Ruby, I think there'd be a lot less conspiracy speculation than there is.
And back and to the left. That's what they kept saying on the JFK movie. That proves that the shot came from the grassy knoll and hit him from the front because his head snapped back and to the left. But they've done a lot of forensics and they did a lot of tests and showed that when you do get hit from behind, Gerald, sometimes your head does snap straight back, making it look like you were hit from the front.
Yeah, Dave, when I first saw the Zapruder film, I think I probably had the same reaction as 99% of people who see the film. You see it and you see the headshot in full time, in real time, and it looks like Kennedy's head, he's shot from the front. Because we've all watched Westerns and war movies and everything else, and every Hollywood movie we've ever seen, somebody gets shot and they go in the opposite direction from the direction they were shot in, right? They fall over the opposite way. So you see Kennedy's head in full time, and it looks like it snaps back, and you think, God, that has to be a front shot. Now, of course, what we can do in terms of ballistics and what can be done in terms of forensics, they take that film, the Zapruder film. Thank goodness for the film, or we never would have proved what happened here. Yet the film is a time clock for the assassination. It's 18.3 frames to a second. So one frame is an 18th of a second, very, very fast, just it flies by. And you go to frame 212, the frame before the headshot, before the bullet hits. And from 212 to 213, 18th of an inch, 18th of a second, Kennedy's head moves just slightly forward by a couple of inches. And that's the bullet that's hitting, moves him slightly forward, and then the next frame, 18th of a second, you see as you go frame by frame, the front part of the president's head blows out as the bullet exits. About a third of his brain and blood matter is blown out from the front of that head. It's a gruesome wound. And the force of that wound was actually calculated by a Nobel-winning physicist, Louis Alvarez, who calls it the jet effect, which is just like a jet engine takes off from a rocket pad, and you see all of the power of the coming out of the back of the jet engine as it propels up into the air. The force of that exit wound from Kennedy's head creates a force greater than Kennedy sitting there and forces the head in the opposite direction, which is back into the left. Exactly what the character Kevin Costner keeps repeating in the JFK film is what you should have, but they make it sound as though it's the opposite of what you should have. The one little side note, you will know this, but a lot of listeners may not. There were two Dallas policemen on motorcycles who were on the backside of the car. They were at the rear of the presidential limousine, riding along the rear. They are sprayed with blood and brain matter. And so people said, that's also proof the shot was from the front, because look at that. Obviously Kennedy was hit, and then the wound sprayed them with blood and brain matter behind it. Now, with the digital enhancement of the Zapruder film, as you go frame by frame, what you see is the front of Kennedy's head explode out, and the two of them riding at 5 to 7 miles an hour drive right into the mist, especially the one on the right, of that wound as it's settling back to the ground. That's what covers them in it. It's that front wound that essentially is there as they drive into it.
Now, the magic bullet theory, where it spun around in the air and took left turns and right turns that conspiracy theorists have talked about over the years, but when you look at it scientifically, Connolly sitting in the front, the seats weren't perfectly aligned with each other. He was off to the side. They weren't of the same height. And then after the first shot, when Connolly turned to his right to look, that bullet is an absolute straight shot through Kennedy and through him. So there really is no magic bullet.
Yeah, it's amazing. The only magic bullet I always say at Dealey Plaza is the one that's fired by the so-called grassy knoll shooter, because that bullet missed everybody. That bullet missed the president, Mrs. Kennedy, missed the governor, Mrs. Connolly, missed the two Secret Service agents in the front, missed the people on the other side of the Dealey Plaza who were standing there watching the motorcade went by. So if there was a front shooter that fired a shot, they missed everyone, and the bullet was never found. But the so-called single bullet, you're right. Again, didn't know how it happened. And the Warren Commission's error on that was that it took the FBI, they said, reconstruct that and see what you can do. And they fired from Oswald's gun into the side like of a pig carcass, and the bullet would come out mangled, really mangled up. And so nobody could understand why that bullet that was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital is deformed slightly because it's flattened a little bit on one side, but it's in very good condition. How did it travel through two men and inflict that set of wounds if you couldn't fire into just one like pig carcass and not have a more mangled bullet? And the answer turned out to be figured out by a company called Failure Analysis in 1992, who does courtroom analysis for expert testimony on things like ballistics. And they realized that they now know the moment at which Kennedy and Connally were hit because they found a part of the Zapruder film in which the right flap of Connally's jacket comes up at frames 224 to 225. It's the bullet. You look then at his suit jacket, that's where the hole went through. So they now, the moment Connally is hit, then they have to see, there's the frame. Now, is Kennedy and Connally aligned at those two frames so that you said one bullet goes through the two of them in a straight line? And it turns out it's exactly a straight line. The bullet's fired from Oswald's rifle at about 2,000 feet a second. Hits Kennedy, the distance he's away, at between 17 and 1,800 feet a second. It doesn't hit any bone. It's a high rear neck, like lower neck, high shoulder entry. Exit through his throat. And at that moment, the bullet's tumbling because it has hit Kennedy. And how do we know it's tumbling? Because the entrance wound on the back of Connally, who's turning around a little, as you said, to see what's going on behind him with the president, is 1.25 inches long in the right shoulder. That's the exact length of the bullet. It's traveling at 15 to 1,600 feet a second. That's when it shatters the fifth right rib, and that's what flattens the bullet down a little bit. It's tumbling. It comes out of Connally's chest underneath his nipple and literally hits his wrist. That's the last bone. It hits at about 900 feet a second. That's enough to break the bone, not enough to deform the bullet. And that is something you say, well, that's an interesting theory, but how would I know that is the case? I reproduced pictures in Case Closed of ballistics fired through two carcasses now, the equivalent of Kennedy and Connally, at the same distance from Oswald. They shoot them through. The bullet slows up. It tumbles. It goes through the same amount of work. It inflicts the same set of wounds, and it comes out almost looking like a carbon copy of the so-called single bullet. So now that bullet can be reproduced all day long. Saying that, by the way, Dave, I always believe that conspiracy theorists spend too much time focused on the so-called single magic bullet, because even if the single bullet happened, as I'm convinced the evidence shows it did, it doesn't tell you who the shooter was. It just tells you that one shot fired from behind the president's motorcade that day hit the president and inflicted a set of wounds on Connally. And that bullet was later found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. But it doesn't tell you how many shots were fired. It doesn't tell you if the kill shot was fired from behind. It doesn't tell you, even if you then determine that all the shots were fired from behind and you determine that Oswald was the shooter, you still have to find out if he was doing it for himself or as part of a conspiracy. So I always think that the single bullet answers only a little bit of the overall questions about the assassination, but I know so many people get hooked into just that question, thinking that if you prove the single bullet, you've proved it's Oswald alone. But I always say not at all. It's just one step in analyzing the evidence.
You know, standing right next to the assassination vehicle, over to the left, Jean Hill and Mary Moorman, two friends. Jean Hill was a school teacher, and Mary Moorman was taking pictures with a Polaroid camera. So she's taking a picture right when JFK was hit, and Jean Hill swears up and down until the day she died in the year 2000. She saw the shot coming from the grassy knoll. She saw smoke coming out from behind the fence. So they ran over there to go down and try and chase the shooter, but they were stopped by two Secret Service agents, and they confiscated her camera, and then a reporter from a Dallas newspaper named Featherstone took the picture away and never gave it back to her, and then they took her up for questioning, and they threatened her life, and it was over the years. It was a whole complicated story, and she changed her story several times as well.
You know, there's a classic example. So what I always say, there's a thing called flashbulb memory. That's for the memory experts who study different situations of trauma call it. And that is that if we have something like 9/11, Kennedy assassination, the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, things like this. There are moments where you're not expecting it. Suddenly something happens, especially if you're a witness to it. And it's like a flashbulb going off. It's this light that goes into your head. Your memory of it is embedded there. But over time, as time goes by, you think about it, you read accounts about it, you listen to other people, you talk to other witnesses, you might see a documentary, and your memory changes so that you could pass a lie detector test about what you believe happened, but it's not accurate. And Jean Hill is one of the prime examples of it, because she did over the years, expand her story to exactly what you said about that she saw a flash of light, a puff of smoke, that she ran up the hills. She was looking for somebody behind the fence. And what I always wondered is, I wonder what she said as a contemporaneous statement, because that's when your memory is the best. And guess what I found out when I went ahead and took a look to see? And she made a statement on November 22nd, actually, the date of the assassination. She said, she told the police that just as Mary was starting to take a picture, she looked at the president in the back seat, and they had a little dog in between them, a little white fluffy dog. Now, we know there was no dog in the president's car, but okay, she later said she was probably confused by white roses. They were actually red. Then she later dropped the story of the dog from her statement completely. And on November 22nd, she said that when he was first shot, she sort of had yelled, "Hey, we want to take your picture," and that he had looked over. But there's a Zapruder film that shows that Hill never moved nor said a word as the president passed by, wasn't even looking at him. And then she said afterwards to the police over a period of time, "Did you see anything?" A Dallas television crew had interviewed her. "Did you see anybody or anything that drew your attention?" And her answer was no. She did not pinpoint a location for the source of the shots. She didn't talk about the white fence. She didn't see any guns, flashes of light, or puffs of smoke. It was only as her story changed over the years that she came to see a second shooter. So, I know that people's memory, it doesn't get better over time, Dave. You change your story over a period of time to become much more sensational. You've got to give me a pretty damn good reason as to why your memory became better when you omitted all of this information on the day that it happened. And in her case, I'm not saying that she made it up. She may have believed it to the last bit of her, essence, but she definitely had a memory that was very, very bad.
It's funny. I saw a documentary not too long ago. It was the Atlanta Pop Festival. It came shortly after Woodstock, and Jimi Hendrix was the headline performer, and they were going to make a big movie about it in a documentary just like Woodstock. It happened in 1970, but for some reason the financing didn't come around, and people forgot about it over the years, and it never got made, but they had the film. So 50 years later, there's a guy in Atlanta. He has a farm outside of town, and he's cleaning out his barn outside, and he found these old tapes up there, like under blankets and behind hay, and then they wound up doing the documentary. Nobody even knew they still existed, and I started thinking about that, Gerald, and I said, you know what? There were so many people out there at Dealey Plaza that day with cameras and handheld cameras, and maybe they don't know what they have. Maybe someday after they pass away, their grandkids will be cleaning their stuff out and develop the film or look at it and say, oh, my God, there's Oswald up there shooting. Somebody might have it and not even know it.
That is definitely possible. I've always thought, Dave, as a matter of fact, that it is possible that sitting in some attic somewhere. I mean, we know that there is film missing of the so-called babushka lady, who's a woman who they called that because she looks like she's sort of wrapped in a large coat and sort of a scarf on, and so that she was dubbed the babushka lady. We don't know if she was a tourist. She was somebody from another city, another country. She was somebody from Dallas filming what looks like she would have a pretty good shot of what the assassination was as it went by. That film's never been found. Could be sitting in somebody's attic. But I also believe that today, if you found tomorrow a film of that was done on the 6th floor of the depository, one of the guys had left a video camera up there and had left it running or that, and it showed Oswald doing the shooting, people would say that's a fake, and they just wouldn't believe it. And even if it had sound and you could hear the shots being fired, those were probably blanks, or maybe that was a test run on a different day, but that wasn't the assassination. So I don't think there's any single piece of evidence that would convince a hardcore, like Oliver Stone type conspiracy theorist to say, all right, you convinced me, it's Oswald. They just can't bring themselves to that.
Yeah, and to this day, Gerald, 61% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy and more than one shooter, or maybe Oswald didn't do it. Only 30% believe that he did it by himself. Bobby Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., believes the CIA was involved. Lots of people on television are pushing that theory as well, especially with the files coming out. Is it just the fact that people have been bombarded with this inaccurate information over the years, blaming the CIA or the Russians or the FBI or the Cubans or the mob, or trying to find some other reason besides the fact that Oswald did it?
Well, I think that, we've also become much more suspicious as a nation. So after Kennedy, people saw the lies over Vietnam. They, went through Watergate. They saw Iran-Contra. Later, there were the lies about weapons of mass destruction that led us into the war in Iraq. So people have become much more suspicious about government. At times, the government does actually conspire against the best interests of its own people. Those conspiracies eventually unravel and become known, but people are suspicious about it. And I think that what happened, particularly in the Kennedy assassination, is the fact that once Oswald is murdered 2 days after, and I understand this. So, for instance, with James, the assassination of King, if once Ray was arrested, if he had been killed 2 days later by somebody with ties to a white supremacist group, we'd be off and running on conspiracy theories. And I think the murder of the assassin, there's one last factor, Dave, I think that you throw into the Kennedy assassination. It's the first modern assassination. King's assassination is the second one, in which an assassin uses a rifle from a long distance. We are accustomed, for the most part, in Trump's recent assassination attempts were going to be rifles as well. But, we're used to usually somebody running up with a pistol and shooting the politician. That's how it happened with George Wallace and Bobby Kennedy. It happens with celebrities, whether with John Lennon and, Reagan when he's shot by Hinckley. Yes, Sirhan with Bobby Kennedy. You know who the shooter is. He's tackled at the scene, and then you have to figure out whether he's doing it for himself or for somebody else. With the rifle shot from a distance, it immediately conjures up the ideas of a paid assassin, Days of the Jackal, stuff like this. Then the assassin gets away in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, so now people aren't even sure who the assassin is. Then you get the assassin arrested, and he's killed 2 days later. I'm surprised, actually, that 30% of Americans do think it's the lone assassin, considering all of that.
You brought up the fact that Oswald, 7 weeks before the assassination, went to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. And was he planning to go to Cuba? Was that the escape plan after he shot Kennedy? Is that why?
I think it's very possible that that was the escape plan. At least he had shown the Cubans that, they wouldn't let him in. He was convinced that that was a mistake. And he was going to show them that he was a real communist, that they had made an error. And Lee Oswald had a life that he'd never really succeeded in anything that he had done. He had sort of had this terrible, we overused the word dysfunctional, but childhood. And when he went into the Marines, he followed his brother into the Marines. He thought that would turn his life around. And it was an unmitigated disaster for him. Some of his fellow Marines thought he was gay. They used to throw him in the shower. They called him Mrs. Oswald. So he hated it there. When he defected to the Soviet Union, he thought at last, he's going to be a hero. They're going to say, you're a former Marine. You defected to the Soviet Union as a communist. That's fantastic. And the Russians told him no. They didn't want him there. And he tried to kill himself. And then they kept him, even though they thought that he psychologically was unstable. They moved him out to this little provincial capital of Minsk, where he meets a Russian girl and ends up getting married. And then dislikes Russia so much he applies to come back to America, and that takes about a year to do. There were other defectors who did the same thing, and they come back into the United States, which he doesn't like. He sets up at one point his own pro-Castro organization, because now he's hot on Castro, tries to kill Walker, which he fails at. Then he sets up a pro-Castro organization in the sweltering summer of 1963 on the streets of New Orleans. He's handing out leaflets to join his organization, Fair Play for Cuba, and he doesn't get a single volunteer. He's failed again. So now he goes down to Mexico City because he wants to travel to Havana, and he gets rejected by the Russians and the Cubans. This is a guy who, at 24 years of age, as he's celebrating that birthday in October of 63, has not succeeded at any of the grand ideas that he had. And when he discovers 2 to 3 days before Kennedy's motorcade arrives that the president's motorcade is going directly in front of the building where he works, because it's published in the Dallas newspapers, it has to be what I call a gift on a silver platter to him. The man who thinks he's going to change history by killing a retired Army general suddenly has an opportunity to throw a cog into the machinery of government, the biggest cog possible, by killing the president. And it's too great an opportunity for him to bypass, and he succeeds at it. The funny thing is today, like you said, 2/3 of Americans don't think he was capable of doing it. He still doesn't get the respect, quote unquote, that he might have thought he would have by killing the president.
Now, Clay Shaw, who was like a businessman, kind of a power broker in New Orleans, and Lee Oswald lived close to there, and I believe worked in the same office building. And David Ferry, who was a Marine, who was in, I think, overseas in Japan at the same time with Oswald. And then people try to make the CIA connection with Oswald. Well, Clay Shaw worked with the CIA, so did David Ferry. Is there any evidence that Lee Oswald was working in cahoots with the CIA, and he was kind of an operative?
No, it's amazing because people go through tortured, convoluted efforts to patch the evidence together to show that. And that's been the case with the release of the 70,000 plus pages that have come out of this latest batch. There are people who should know better who are saying, well, look at that. That's very interesting. They, meaning the CIA, they were reading Oswald's mail when he was in Russia. And it turns out that they had read one of his mother's letters to Oswald at the time. And they, the CIA, opened a file on him in 1959. That must mean they were interested in him as an intelligence asset. Guess what? He defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. It was in the newspapers. Of course, the CIA opened a file on him. They would have been absolutely negligent. It would have been malpractice for them not to. So that makes perfect sense. And then they say, well, the CIA was watching him when he went to Mexico City. Of course they did. They had surveillance on those two missions. The question I always say is out there is not whether Oswald to the CIA because he was too unstable to be trusted by any intelligence organization, but whether the CIA should have known from its own surveillance on the Cuban and the Soviet missions in Mexico City that Oswald had such unhinged behavior as he did. And when he came back into the United States, when he was rejected from going to Cuba, that they should have warned the FBI. The FBI would have made him a priority and possibly prevented the assassination. It's a long shot, but it's still one of those what ifs that we'll never know the answer to.
I love the fact that you admit that you kind of believed in the conspiracy theories before you wrote the Case Closed back in 1993. And it kind of changed your mind when you dove in and did all the research on the subject. And even at the beginning of this interview, you said, hey, if some bombshell comes out or some paperwork comes out with the release of these JFK files, I'm open-minded maybe to change my mind, but they're going to have to prove it. And so far, nothing.
That's all I ask for is evidence. And I'll tell you what the key evidence is, and it's a very short window. When Oswald comes back from Mexico City in early October, he's been rejected. He would have been in Havana if he got the okay to travel there. So he wouldn't have even been around when Kennedy visited Dallas. There would have been no assassination with Lee Harvey Oswald. So he comes back dejected in early October. What people forget about Dave is that when he went to Mexico City for his trip, he leaves New Orleans on a bus that's an overnight ride on September 25th of 63. Next day is when the White House announced for the first time publicly that the president, JFK, would visit Texas in November for a political trip. So before that announcement from the White House, nobody even knew that Kennedy was going to go to Texas. When Oswald back in early October, there was no opportunity for conspiracy to have planned an assassination involving Oswald and the president in Dallas before Oswald left for Mexico City, because no one knew the president was going there. Oswald comes back in on October 1st. You essentially have 6 weeks in which the challenge that I have to conspiracy theorists is you've got to show me a piece of evidence of how the deep state, the Russians, the Cubans, whoever, how they brought Oswald into a conspiracy to kill the president. There are no cell phones. There are no text messages. You can't do it through WhatsApp. There's no mental telepathy in which you can send him a message. You have to do it the old-fashioned way. Somebody has to call him. Somebody has to visit him. And the FBI went through all of the phone records of every payphone around the area where he lived and in the depository and his own records. They went through all of the people who lived with Oswald in this rooming house to see if anybody visited him. They had not. You need to have a scrap of evidence that says, here's how they brought Oswald into the plot. And that's what's missing. The conspiracy theorists can't even make the case that in the 6 weeks leading up to the assassination, there was a moment in which some conspirator reached out and said, hey, Lee, we want you to kill the president on this day. That's because it just didn't happen that way.
My last question, and I appreciate, Gerald, you taking all the time here. This is fascinating stuff. My last question, supposedly, whether it was the CIA or working with the mob or whatever, there were 2 assassination plots against Kennedy before Dallas, one in Tampa and one in Chicago. And for some reason, the logistics or the timing, they just couldn't pull them off then. So then they put in a third one in Dallas. So is there any evidence that he was supposed to be killed in Tampa and Chicago before Dallas?
There had always been rumors since that in Chicago that they had a threat. There was also a political discussion which stopped Kennedy from going, but there are no doubts that there were threats against Kennedy's life beforehand, just as there were threats. I think the modern American president had received more threats in his first term than anybody else. Had been Barack Obama for a while, but every president is getting threats against his life. Maybe Trump is, challenging that record in some ways, and they sometimes operate on them, and they sometimes worry or they change a route. Ever since Kennedy, of course, they no longer publish them. In Tampa, there's absolutely no evidence, as a matter of fact, about there having been an effort to kill the president. The reason I say that with such confidence, Dave, Tampa, literally just right before he ends up going to Dallas, is an open air motorcade, just like he had in Dallas. So he's in the convertible, and is the longest motorcade of his entire presidency. It's 25 and a half miles. So for 25 miles, he's going in an open motorcade all through Tampa. And they were not, they're always worried about a threat against his life, but obviously not enough that day to either cancel the motorcade, put him in a hardtop, or cut down the length of the motorcade.
Well, fantastic. So if I could go on and on all day, we're going to have to have you on again, Gerald, because this is fascinating stuff. Gerald Posner, the author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. Love having you on. Great stuff as always. Thanks for hanging in there with us, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it. Thanks for having me, Dave. I really appreciate it.
And there he goes, Gerald Posner. Everybody go out and get that book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the JFK Assassination, here on Dave Smith Unleashed. Don't forget, thanks to MTS Transportation, we're giving away 4 tickets to a Dodger game this week, probably on the Friday show. We're giving away 4 tickets, and they're field by, MTS Transportation, they're not going to stick you up in the nosebleeds. They're field boxes right down by the field with preferred parking and access to the stadium club. And if that's not enough, we're going to be doing this once a month. 4 tickets, field boxes, preferred parking to Dodgers games. But you have to be a subscriber to the YouTube channel for subscribers only. So make sure you tune in, make sure you subscribe, and one of you is going to get those 4 Dodger tickets for April 29th against the Miami Marlins. And then in May, we're going to give away 4 more. But you have to be a subscriber. So make sure you listen and make sure you subscribe on YouTube. All right, we will talk to you again on Friday on Dave Smith Unleashed.